through social media and through various channels now, people are exposed to more fad diets than ever before.
We've learned a lot about processing, and there are really four big factors where the evidence is very strong. We don't really have long-term studies of coconut oil, but from everything we know, I would be hesitant about consuming that. The Asian American women have about 3 times the diabetes risk compared to the European American women.
For someone who now wants to make a change, what are maybe the top 3 or the top 4 things that you would say that they should start off with so that it doesn't seem so overwhelming? Welcome to the second episode of From Birth to Bloom. I'm so excited that you're back, and today's guest is so special. We're welcoming Dr. Walter Willet, who's a physician and epidemiologist and a professor at the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health in the departments of nutrition and epidemiology. Dr. Willet has spent his entire career in trying to help us understand how food impacts major diseases. Dr. Willet is a part of the National Academy of Medicine, is one of the most cited nutritional scientists worldwide. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Willet to this podcast and for all of his insights. Thank you so much, Dr. Willet, for being here. And I know how busy your schedule is, so this just means so much that you could take out the time and actually come on this podcast so we could have a conversation about all things related to nutrition. The reason that I wanted to have this podcast, and I thought it would be really important to have a voice like yourself on this podcast, is because through social media and through various channels now, people are exposed to more fad diets than ever before. Things like the carnivore diet and the keto diet, and just all of these different fad terms catch on. They last for a couple of months and then they die down. But in all of this, people are really ruining their health, if I could say that. It's really messing up their metabolism, just their overall composition. Which is why I think having a voice like yourself, which is so deeply rooted in research and in data, to have a conversation about this whole wide variety of conversations which come up within the field of nutritional science. Before we begin, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about why you got into this field of nutrition. What made you so excited about it, drawn towards it? And I know that you've worked in Dar es Salaam as well. And just how did you find yourself exploring all of these different avenues?
It's probably natural that I've ended up working in the field of nutrition. My family has been involved in agriculture for many decades and many generations, in fact. We had a family farm. In fact, it's still in the family in Michigan, in the central part of the United States. And my grandfather and his grandfather and his grandfather basically had dairy cattle there. But in some ways, it was also a very small farm and mostly subsistence farming when I look back at it. My father actually did research on dairy cattle, and I grew up raising vegetables mostly. And in fact, I supported my college tuition growing vegetables. So I have been engaged in food. I actually got interested in human nutrition when I was about 10 years of age. And we were living in Madison, Wisconsin, and hosted a woman, Saranya Reddy from India, who was getting her PhD in nutrition there. And she got me really interested in human nutrition. So I've sort of, when I went through medical school and beyond, I've always had part of my work involving nutrition. And I also got interested in epidemiology. After completing medical school and residency in internal medicine, I taught at the University of Dar es Salaam for 3 years and started off teaching internal medicine there, but switched over, having done an MPH in public health here at Harvard here. I switched over and started teaching public health and got more interested in epidemiology. And when I came back to do a doctoral degree, I realized that we really needed to pull together nutrition and epidemiology, because the nutrition until that point had been mainly working on test tubes in animals and very small human studies. But we really needed the power of epidemiology to be able to look at what happens to us in the long term with regard to cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other health outcomes, depending on what we were eating years or decades beforehand. So that's what I've been working on ever since.
Absolutely. And I think the conversation of how nutrition is so deeply rooted in the field of non-communicable diseases now has started coming more into the limelight. I think even perhaps as I was growing up or when my parents were young, you knew you had to eat healthy, but you never knew why. So I think the connection between the two is now becoming so much more important to understand. And we're all surrounded by ultra-processed food. And We know it's bad, but could you shed a little bit of light on what the data tells us?
Well, actually, I think the idea, the term ultra-processed food, the way we've been using it, is actually a little bit of a distraction. We know that most of our food is overly processed, but the way the definition is being used now, it's really describing where the food was produced, and if it's been produced in a commercial factory, that means it's ultra-processed, but it ignores the actual nutritional value of the food. And we've learned a lot about processing, and there are really 4 big factors where the evidence is very strong. And that's that refining whole grains and converting them to refined grains throws away about 2/3 of the minerals and vitamins and fiber and phytochemicals that are there in the natural whole grains. And we end up eating this refined starch, which is mostly converted to sugar very quickly after we consume it. What happens to the fiber and the vitamins and minerals? Well, that's fed to animals because it's so nutritious. So we end up eating the junk, and the animals get the nutritious in the diet. And it's very sad. I know in India, for example, where I have a lot of collaborations that in most population surveys now, there's very few whole grains being consumed. That most people are eating refined grains instead. And that's a perfect fuel for diabetes and obesity that we've come to realize. Also, in the process of producing food, that oftentimes a lot of sodium is added, or salt, and that's not good for us. And of course, the conversion of sugarcane into sugar is made a form of calories that is detrimental to health as well. And then trans fat, we've come to realize, is a huge problem as well. A lot of our early research was on trans fat. And in the United States and many other countries, that's been banned now, but I think it's still available in India, that the vegetable ghee there. We actually brought some samples back to Boston, and I'd never seen levels of trans fat so high. It was over 50% in some of the ghee samples, the vegetable ghee samples that we analyzed from India. So there, in other countries around the world, trans fats are still a big problem. So I think definitely sugar sweetened beverages are the single most important problem that we see, because we consume so much sugar so quickly that way. But these other aspects of processing, refining of grains, adding too much sodium, making trans fat, and adding too much sugar, those are real problems. But ultra-processed doesn't necessarily pay attention to those.
Correct.
The way it's being used.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that you mentioned how the samples that came back from India showed high levels of trans fat. And yes, you're absolutely correct that it's widely available in India right now. And one very astonishing fact is that when things are made in India, the export quality is different, and the quality which stays back in India is different. So for more and more things, and for really important things like baby formula, the constitution is different, whereas the one that's kept back in India contains oils and contains sugars, whereas the ones which are exported don't. So definitely the policies that are surrounding food in India are a little bit loose, and a lot of manufacturers, of course, try to get their way around it in whatever way possible, maybe to save on cost, maybe to increase palatability.
Right. That's unfortunately the case in a lot of countries. The exports are often the healthiest foods, and what stays at home is often second class. So it's clearly hugely important that everybody has access to healthy foods, and it's possible. We can see it is something that we can not just aim for, but it's not something that is out of sight.
Absolutely. When we think about what are the most critical factors in the field of nutrition when it comes to maybe a pregnant woman or a young child, through all of your research, is there anything that you would say is the most important thing, or the top 3 most important things when it comes to thinking about the nutrition for a pregnant woman or for a young child?
Yeah. Well, a good question. And the reality is that nutrition, it's not about 1, 2, or even 3 things. I liken it to an orchestra, where you need all the pieces and you need them in the right balance, or else it doesn't work. So that makes it, of course, a little bit more complicated, but that's the reality of good nutrition. If we're thinking about diet during pregnancy, one of the most important things is to keep weight within the guidelines there, because clearly underweight during pregnancy is a problem, but overweight is a problem too, in terms of the outcomes for the woman and for the child going forth into the future. In terms of the diet, the quality of the diet, again, everything's important, but one particular, well, let me step back. Probably the traditional Mediterranean type diet actually is a really good model. And we know about it enough so that we can apply that general model to all other cultures around the world. It doesn't have to be necessarily olive oil. It can be healthy vegetable oils as well that are not partially hydrogenated, basically in liquid form, and whole grains, plenty of fruits and vegetables, and emphasizing mostly plant-based sources of protein, but not necessarily being a vegan or strict vegetarian. Yeah. And that seems to be a good diet for pregnant women too, along with keeping weight in good control. One area of particular interest and importance, though, is getting enough omega-3 fatty acids. And we actually did some studies in India, and we found in Delhi and Bangalore, there was almost no omega-3 fatty acid consumption unless people consumed mustard oil. And then they were getting a good bit of omega-3 fatty acids from that source. But otherwise, almost no fish. You can understand why. It's a long way to the ocean. Yeah. And fish won't smell so good. I mean, get it a few thousand miles away traditionally. Yeah. So it's understandable that there's not much fish, but we do see that we can get omega-3 fatty acids from plant sources as well.
Absolutely.
And that the omega-3 fatty acids during pregnancy are particularly important because that's omega-3 fatty acids are a major part of the brain and our nervous system. And if that's not developed during pregnancy, there will be long-term consequences in terms of cognitive function and learning abilities of the young child and going forth into adulthood.
Absolutely. That brings me actually really well into my next point, which is all about omega-3s and omega-6s, which have been a buzzword for a long time. I remember that even when I was young, I was told to have cod liver oil because it was supposed to be good for omega-3. Now, as we were actually talking about today, that the balance is what's most important rather than just one or just the other. It's that unique balance between the omega-3 and the 6, which makes the combination good for us and our brains and our bodies. If we were to think about what's a healthy fat that people should be consuming, one of it is, of course, to do with the oils that people are using in their cooking. But the other is what healthy fat can you consume regularly, things like nuts and seeds. Could you shed a little bit of light on what food is optimum to attain this balance between the 3s and 6s?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that getting enough both enough omega-3 and omega-6 is really critical. They're both together make up the majority of our brain, actually. And we need to get them from our diet because we can't synthesize them ourselves. The added fats from plant oils are really important because in most diets, quite a bit of that makes up quite a few calories. And so that source is really important. Nuts are a good source of polyunsaturated fat. Most of that will be in most nuts and seeds, it will be mostly omega-6 fatty acids. Walnuts actually are sort of unique, having a fairly good amount of omega-3 fatty acids as well. And soy foods are actually high and have a good amount of both omega-6 and omega-3. So if I had to take one food, actually, soy foods are pretty good. And it's so interesting to me that in China, that is perhaps the major source of protein is soy foods. In India, almost zero. And it would be really good, I think, if there was some mixing actually back and forth. And I've talked to some of my colleagues in India, and they say, yes, we could make a lot of even our traditional dishes could be made out of tofu or other kinds of soy foods. And
absolutely,
I think that would be really good because the beans are a healthy protein source, but actually not very many of the essential fatty acids in beans. So soy is relatively inexpensive, and it should be possible to grow soy in lots of places where you could grow beans as well. So again, variety is really important, and having a balance is desirable for human nutrition. And it wouldn't be bad to having some more beans in Japan either. So I think, again, some exchange there, some eating cultures would be really helpful.
I think in India, the misconception is that if you eat a lot of soy, it causes estrogen dominance, which can then lead to things like breast cancer, etc., which is why a lot of people refrain from it. And then we have more widely available protein sources, things like paneer, for example, which is cottage cheese, that's more widely available and more like culturally adopted since years and years now, which is perhaps why people don't tend to opt for soy food. But like you had said today itself, that it's not about what the food is, it's about how much processing has happened. And that's what makes it harmful or not harmful or good or bad.
Yes, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There were legitimate concerns. I had them myself about the soy estrogens that are present in soy foods. But we actually have enough data now to see that they're actually related to lower risk of breast cancer. Some good data coming out of China, where the consumption of soy foods is high, actually showed that despite the concern about increases in risk of cancer, there was actually a lower risk of breast cancer. And that seems to be because those estrogens in soy products actually block the estrogens that our body makes. And so it's like the drug tamoxifen, which actually is used for treatment and prevention of breast cancer. It looks like soy products are acting more like that. And dairy foods are okay, but again, in moderation. That it looks like about 1 serving a day of dairy foods would be a reasonable amount. And with that, you'll get a good amount of calcium and some other minerals and vitamins. But there's almost no polyunsaturates, essential fatty acids in dairy foods. And the environmental impact is actually quite substantial of dairy production as well. So I think about once a day, I usually have it as yogurt, which seems to have some extra advantages that I think is about the right amount for dairy foods if someone wants to consume dairy foods. And then try some other protein sources like tofu or some soy products, and of course traditional beans as well as part of the mix.
Absolutely. A question that a lot of people have now is what kind of fat should I be used for cooking? Because in the middle, there was this whole surge of coconut oil. And after coming here, I actually realized that coconut oil isn't all that good. It's not as good as what we once thought it used to be. Now there's this surge of using avocado oil, for example. What, according to you, is the most optimum oil that should be used? Because, of course, now we know that butter and margarine is not that good for you. So I'm not even putting that into the mix, but just oil.
Yeah, we've now have quite a few decades of research on different sources of oil. I think the most time-tested is olive oil, because we've studied the Mediterranean diet for many, many decades, and people have been consuming that for thousands of years in quite large amounts, actually about 30% of calories in Greece at some points in time, and people were really healthy doing that. So I have a lot of confidence in that. But now we've been able to look at other types of oil, and we see soybean oil being quite good. Canola or rapeseed oil or mustard oil is really the traditional version of that, seems to be good. Especially mustard oil, I would have some variety. Again, variety is a good thing. So the sunflower oil is a good source of oil, but it doesn't have the omega-3 fatty acids in it. So if you're going to have that, you might have some mustard oil. And part of the time it doesn't have, you could mix it or just, for different meals. The fatty acids stay in our body a long time, so we don't have to have the right balance every single day, but over a week or months, it's good to have some variety. Coconut oil is very high in saturated fat. Again, very little essential fatty acids there. We don't really have long-term studies of coconut oil, but from everything we know, I would be hesitant about consuming that in large amounts. I really like the flavor, and so for some dishes, sure, have it now and then, but not as, I think, a major primary fat used for cooking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that I hear you say a lot, even in the span of this conversation, and of course, over all of my time here, is the fact that variety is important. And gradually, I feel like people are becoming a little bit more restrictive in terms of how they eat. They adopt very drastic diets, things like the carnivore diet and the keto diet, and being absolutely plant-based or raw vegan. All of these different hype words or just buzzwords are floating around the internet. And I don't really understand what the long-term ramifications of these might be. I'm, of course, a little bit more hesitant about them, having studied everything that I have. But could you shed a little bit more light on what these fad diets or restrictive diets do to a person's body?
Well, the reality is we don't really have long-term studies because, as you've been saying, these diets come and go, and we don't have decades of follow-up on them. But in general, variety is a good thing for two reasons. One is that if there's something bad in a food, we're not going to get too much of it. It's sort of diluted out. And also, we're less likely to miss out on something that's essential or really important. So there's a simple fundamental reason why general variety is a good thing to do. But of course, you're going to have a variety of unhealthy foods. It should be a variety of healthy foods. Again, we do want to get, we need a variety of nutrients and phytochemicals to be healthy. And so that general approach does make sense. And particularly where we're not sure about the exact amounts of which food or another. And we have a lot to learn in that area. But I think that playing it safe and having variety being somewhere in the middle, we know works quite well, and people can be very healthy that way. Maybe we can fine tune it, and we probably can fine tune it a little bit more of that or a little bit of something else. But I think given what we know now, that variety and something that's a reasonable balance, not the extremes, is a good path to take.
Absolutely. And when we think about things like a healthy diet versus an unhealthy diet, are we simply talking in terms of a minimally processed diet versus a highly processed diet? Should we be looking at something else, maybe micronutrient consumption? Is there anything else that you take into account, for example, when thinking about what's a healthy versus an unhealthy diet?
Well, just whether it's highly processed or unprocessed doesn't really make the important distinction, because we could have a diet that is mostly, the Northern European diet, lots of dairy, unprocessed, lots of red meat, unprocessed, lots of potatoes, not such a good source of calories. And we could have a very unprocessed diet that would be not very healthy. In general, though, processing has been actually very important in reducing microbial contamination, pasteurization of milk, for example, and other forms of keeping our food safe from contamination. So there is a role for processing, but we need to be very careful and selective. I would call it smart processing. Smart processing that retains the nutritional value of food, but achieving the other goals, which would make it preservation, so we have it available for the next growing season, minimizing microbial contamination, sometimes adding flavors. Traditional processing, I think it was widely used in India in the past, was parboiling of rice. And that's pretty good, actually, because especially if we leave it as whole grain rice and parboil it, that kills the insects and things that often inhabit rice right from the field. I remember in Tanzania where you get rice right from the field, and after a few weeks in the jar, things be crawling around it. So parboiling kills that. It also stabilizes the fatty acids there. They don't go rancid so quickly. And it increases the glycemic index of the starch, so it's more slowly absorbed and digested. And it has other important characteristics that add to shelf life as well. So there's some of those traditional forms of processing that we should really return to. I think now that we've understand them better. So again, there's room for processing, but we really have to be sure we don't destroy the nutritional value in the process.
Absolutely. And people who might be listening to this, I can imagine mostly are from India and want to now make a change in their diet, which has drawn them into this podcast, and they're kind of getting access to this knowledge. And you have also spent a long time working in India and researching and collaborating on projects in India. What do you think are a few things that are very specific to that subcontinent, which play a role into their health challenges later on? Like, for example, one thing that you'd mentioned earlier is the fact that India has now switched to more refined grains, which, as we know, is leading to obesity and diabetes. And India is the diabetic capital of the world. So we are seeing the numbers matching up to the changes that have been made in our diet. So having now studied all of this, what would your perspective be on what an Indian person should take care of?
Yeah. Well, I've discussed that with some of my Indian colleagues, and they had the same conclusion that I did too, that the very large amount of carbohydrate in the diet that is now increasingly almost all refined carbohydrate, and that we do see in our long-term studies is a recipe for type 2 diabetes, especially if we haven't been used to having that diet and abundance of food all the time. And also, we can't forget about the physical activity part of the equation as well, because in almost every country around the world, people are much less active, even in countries that are low income and even rural areas. People used to walk more, had their work involved physical activity, and we didn't have television. And that has been a huge issue, that we now have transportation, buses. Even if people can't afford a car, they're not riding bicycles or walking and spending hours in front of a screen every day. And that creates a perfect storm, because we are less active, we have more insulin resistance, and then we overload our system with very rapidly absorbed refined carbohydrates. And that is really, I think, the hugest issue facing India and many parts of the world as well.
Absolutely. And it's that combination of thinking that, for example, things like dal or lentils or beans are the perfect amount or are the perfect source of protein, which is not true, because they're also part carbohydrates. So anyway, that carbohydrate consumption is there. And then that's supplemented with things like flour or rice, which are again carbohydrates. So it's like part carbohydrate with an additional of carbohydrate. Potato is widely consumed, again another carbohydrate. Sugar is widely consumed, one more part. So it's just constantly feeding your body that much amount of carbohydrate in a continent actually which didn't have access to food. So epigenetically, we're trained to hold on to food a lot more than other continents and other ethnicities, because we had a lack of it. For example, there's a word which is used very often to describe challenges which Indian people might face, which is known as skinny fat, whereas actually you're not BMI-wise fat. But because of that tendency to hold on to abdominal fat, people develop things like a metabolic syndrome. So it's a very unique genetic predisposition that we have, which might not replicate itself in other ethnicities, but it's something to kind of keep in mind as well.
Right. It is. That's added a third dimension to the perfect storm here. Less activity, more refined starches, and then some genetic vulnerability that worked fine until maybe not so long ago, 50 years ago. There was very little diabetes in India and Africa too. That although this isn't totally unique to India, we see this happening around the world. In China, for example, there's also an explosion. Maybe not quite as severe as in India, but the rates of diabetes are going way beyond what we see in our population from European heritage in the United States. We've also seen that actually in our large cohort studies, that we have about 200,000 women we've been tracking for almost 50 years now. And we see that the rates in Asian Americans, when we control for diet and activity and smoking and everything, the Asian American women have about 3 times the diabetes risk compared to the European American women. But Hispanics and African American women are also at quite a bit of elevated risk, although not quite as high as the Asian women. So it definitely seems that through evolution, we were not designed to live in the environment that we're living in now. The good news of it is all that means that there's a huge potential for prevention. It doesn't have to be this way. And we understand it well enough now so that we can see with a good pattern of physical activity and a healthy diet, everybody can have low rates of diabetes.
Absolutely. And you brought up the Nurses' Health Study, which is one of the largest cohort studies that have been following the same set of women for 50 years. And I think the amount of data which has come out of that study has really shaped how we think about health now, because we've never had a population which has been tracked for this long ever before. And in understanding this population and in working with this population for so long, what are these unique challenges which women tend to have, which otherwise are not very often seen in men? And the reason I ask this is because more and more women are entering the workforce worldwide now. And their challenges are, of course, things like how do you parent while you're still working, and how do you parent if you're not at home all the time, and the struggle of, I want my child to eat healthy, but I just don't have that time anymore. But what is so different in their own health or in their own journey towards getting good health, which otherwise the other side of population, like in men, we don't see that.
Well, to go back to your first point, actually, it's sort of the time stress and challenge to have a career, be working, and also taking care of a family is huge and challenging. And that's actually one reason why there's some room for processed foods. But again, it should be smartly processed foods that retain the healthful aspects, but maybe partially processed to make it, you don't have to go shop and get 10 different ingredients. And that's the shopping is a big time sink as well. And then hours in the kitchen cooking, that's just not possible for so many people. And many people don't have a kitchen even. So there is, again, there's room for some smart processing there. But then women have their own health issues. Of course, breast cancer is really number one factor. And when we started the Nurses' Health Study, that was our primary outcome, because in men, there is no common cancer that occurs in age 30s, 40s, or 50s. Prostate cancer, yes, but that's in later life. So there's not really a comparable cancer in men as breast cancer. And it is in almost every country now becoming a very leading cause of death in women. And we understand quite a bit of what's underlying that risk, high risk for breast cancer, but it's also one of the more difficult diseases to study, because we do see that when people, say from Japan, which has been well studied, move to the United States, they within one generation their colorectal cancer rates go up to be the same. It was much, much lower traditionally in Japan, but they are the same now as European Americans after just one generation. But it takes about 3 generations for breast cancer rates to catch up, which suggests that there is some transgenerational effects of diet that are not there for some other cancers. And we don't totally understand that. But we do see that weight gain during adult life is a risk factor for breast cancer after menopause. And we understand that pretty well, because that those extra fat cells secrete a lot of estrogens, and that increases breast cancer risk. Breast cancer before menopause, we still understand less well than most other cancers, actually. But what we are seeing is that diet during adolescence is very important for breast cancer, more important than diet in midlife even. And it looks like, again, that Mediterranean type diet with whole grains, more fruits and vegetables, more plant sources of protein during adolescence is important for breast cancer risk during the premenopausal years. So it's fascinating to look across life now. We're starting to connect the decades as we go forward.
Absolutely. And I think thinking about childhood, adolescence is such a crucial piece when we think about how do you prevent chronic diseases or prevent life-threatening diseases. Because a lot of, like you said, like a lot of patterns get formed in adolescence as well, but also a lot of habits get formed. Whereas like things that you pick up when you're a child are very difficult to undo as you're getting older. And it's all of those that then contribute towards getting chronic, non-communicable diseases as we know them now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Ideally, we would start off with our mothers eating a healthy diet while they were pregnant with us, and set us on a good path when we were age 1 or 2, and then keep us on a good path going forward. And that's the ideal path. But we do also see that people can make changes, even in their 70s or 80s, that will help reduce their risk. So oftentimes people have sort of ignored their health until they get to age 50 or so, and then things start to catch up with them. But we can never totally reverse all the damage, but we can still make an important difference, even if we're 60 or 70. But definitely, what we're seeing more and more is that period, childhood and adolescence, is critical. We actually had some hints about the adolescence and childhood a period being especially important for breast cancer because in the American atomic bombing in World War II of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, women who were over age 40 and got radiated did not have much increase in breast cancer. But if they were children or young adults, then breast cancer risk went up decades later. So there seems to be some special vulnerability to breast tissue and probably some other cancers, but especially breast cancer during that early period of life. And so it looks like you want to have protective dietary factors in place there as well, like the antioxidants in fruits and vegetables and plant oils.
Absolutely. So as we close off and we get close to the end, I just wanted to ask you one last question, which was, for someone who now wants to make a change, what are maybe the top 3 or the top 4 things that you would say that they should start off with so that it doesn't seem so overwhelming? Because nutrition and food is such a deep part of our culture and of our habits and of just our daily routine that it becomes very challenging to completely take a turn around and say, from today, I'll stop doing this altogether. But what's a good place to start at least?
Yeah, well, you make a good point that a complete change around is hard for most people. Sometimes people do have a brother died of cancer or a heart attack or something like that, and people will totally change it overnight almost. But more often, it's a stepwise process. And we do see that for every step in a good direction, we get some health benefits. So that's important, that even modest changes will have benefits to them. It partly depends on where you start. And I think in a population that is consuming huge amounts of refined carbohydrate, probably the most important thing would be to shifting toward more whole grain carbohydrates. And you can actually add some fats in there, some healthy plant oils that replace some of those calories. Probably shifting toward, again, it depends on the starting point, but shifting to some healthy plant proteins. Now, I know in India, a large part of the population is already vegetarian. So it's not like in the United States where I would put high red meat consumption at the top of the problem list.
But it's still there in India. I think people are shifting more towards the non-vegetarian lifestyle as compared to how they were before.
So I think that is good. I would note, though, that if someone is going to be a strict vegetarian or almost strict vegetarian, you will become deficient in vitamin B12 and some other vitamins. So I think actually if someone's going to be really a vegan or close to vegan, taking a multiple vitamin, multi-mineral supplement is a good thing. Now, some of my nutritionists friends don't like the idea of taking a supplement, but actually compared to buying a serving of meat or something like that, it's actually much less expensive usually. Not an expensive high dose supplement, but just a RDA level supplement to be sure you don't have a big hole in the nutritional profile for minerals and vitamins. But again, in general, shifting toward more whole grain forms of carbohydrate, shifting to healthy fats would be 2 really important things to do. I would also mention a lot of our work recently has been on the environmental impacts of diets, and we do see that our food systems are contributing about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions and helping drive climate change, which is, I think, even more of a threat to our civilization than our diets, because much of this is irreversible. In reality, India is not. It's just like with fuels, it's not the major source of those kinds of greenhouse gas emissions from compared to the countries consuming a lot of animal sources of protein. But I think it turns out it's actually healthier to be having these more modest servings of animal sources of protein. What I use is a very simple rule. It makes it really easy to plan a day. Just 1 + 1, and most people can understand that. About 1 serving of dairy a day, and then 1 modest serving of another animal source protein, if one wants to have some animal sources of protein. Again, you could be a vegetarian if you wanted to, but if you want to have some animal sources of protein, that 1 + 1 works pretty well. You will get the adequate amounts of nutrients from that, but not overdo it. It's, I think, having that's sort of the right balance.
Yeah, that's actually a really easy way to think about it. So 1 serving of dairy, 1 serving of any other animal protein if you wish, and then everything else is fruits or vegetables. And like, of course, healthy fats and all of that. But kind of thinking about it almost like a scaffolding around which you build your house, that it should be built on a scaffolding of fruits, vegetables, a modest amount of dairy, and a modest amount of animal meat. And then that should be a good place to begin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I think this is such an important conversation to have, as we're living in this world which is just surrounded by misinformation, and that just makes things so much more confusing for people who don't necessarily study this, because I don't think schools educate children about what nutrition looks like, and then you kind of don't do that even as you grow up. But it's such a vital piece of knowledge to have, especially when we think about non-communicable chronic diseases.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just our schools. Our medical schools don't teach it either. So oftentimes doctors are a source of misinformation.
That's so true.
We do a much better job educationally.
So true. That's so true. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time again. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of From Birth to Bloom. We'll be back next week with another special guest. But in the meantime, I hope that everything Dr. Willet shared with us today is something that you will reflect back on in the choices that you make for yourself and your families.